I'm Ariel. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is the second episode of our YouTube Live series, where we'll be covering the Associate Product Manager program here at Google. I'm joined today by Svetlana and Noel, who will be available on the chat if you have any questions as we're going along. We'll also save some time at the end for your live Q&A. I'll start with a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Boston. I moved out to California for college. I studied symbolic systems at Stanford with a focus in human-computer interaction. I joined Google in 2015 through the Associate Product Manager program. I spent my first rotation on Search, where I worked on Knowledge Graph, and my second rotation was on Chrome. I've since continued as a product manager on the Chrome team, and I'm currently based in our San Francisco office. Today, I'm talking to you live from our YouTube headquarters in San Bruno, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like to be an APM. As APMs, our jobs are to figure out what the most important problems are to solve, how we're going to solve them, and then making sure that all of that happens. It can sound like a ton of responsibility, which can be equally exciting and terrifying. But one of the great things about the APM program is that you have a ton of support from your team, from your manager, and from other APMs. Let's take these one at a time. I'll start with talking about figuring out what the most important problems are to solve. Sometimes this can be the toughest part because there's always a ton to work on, but you have limited time and limited resources. I remember finding this super intimidating at first. I mean, how was I supposed to know? But the good news is that we're definitely not figuring it out alone. One of the ways that I find helpful to get started here is to think about where we want our team and our product to be in a year, and what are some of the important problems we have to solve in order to get there. Let's talk about a few ways to get started. First, as a product manager, it's critical that you know your product and know your users. Play with your product. What do you think could be better about the experience? Talk to users if you can. And while you may not be representative of all your users, your intuition as a product manager can get you a pretty long way. Second, try and get familiar with the data. What can you learn about user behaviors or what's going on in the world that might affect your product in the future? Understanding your metrics can give you a lot of clarity when you're uncertain. And finally, gather opinions from your team. We're super lucky to work with a ton of really smart and creative people all around us. Talk to your engineers, designers, UX researchers, partnerships, or people who sell your product. All of these people have slightly different perspectives on your product and might have different insights to share than you do. So, let's say that you and your team have figured out what the highest impact problems are for you to solve. Now you have to figure out how you're going to solve them, so you're just getting started. As APMs, we're responsible for setting a vision for our team. Once you know what the important problems are to work on, what does success actually look like once you've solved those? A few things can be really important here. First, let's talk about setting and communicating your vision and roadmap. A big part of our job as APMs is to get our teams aligned and working towards a common goal. You've done a ton of work behind the scenes. You've gathered data, you've talked to your team, you've played with your product, you've reached out to users. Now you have to convey to your team what you're working towards and why that's important. This is critical for a few reasons. First, your team works better together when they know what they're working towards. Second, it helps them make smart trade-offs when tough decisions come up. And lastly, it keeps your team motivated during the ups and downs that inevitably happen in any project. Different PMs have different styles for how they come up with and how they communicate their visions. Some PMs are really good at creating user empathy and storytelling. Other PMs are great at data analysis and telling a story with numbers. And some PMs are really good at anticipating where the market's going to be in a few years and identifying opportunities that way. There are a million different ways for you to come up with and communicate your vision with the help, support, and expertise of your teammates. What matters is that you take all of those inputs, and as a product manager, you're able to clearly communicate that vision and get your team excited about it. So let's say that you've set this vision and your team's rallied behind it and really excited to get started on working on it. Now, you have to figure out what the next steps are along the way. You have to pick the right milestones to help your team build towards that goal. At Google, this usually comes in the form of OKRs. OKRs stands for Objectives and Key Results. The O, Objectives, is the high-level goal that you're trying to achieve with your product and for your users. KRs are what are the key results that you expect to see along the way to make sure that you're accomplishing your objective. Setting OKRs requires a few things. First, you have to have success metrics. Setting measurable goals is a big part of the culture here at Google. Having success metrics helps clarify what you're working towards, and it helps your team and empowers them to make decisions about what will help accomplish those goals. Finally, success metrics help you track progress and make sure that you're headed in the right direction. Setting OKRs also requires you to prioritize. As a product manager, it's really important that you understand what the highest impact parts of your work are in order to help your team spend their time wisely. Different PMs have different styles, and it's something that I've been working on and figuring out over my 3 years as a product manager, just by trying a bunch of different things. The best way to be a product manager is whichever way gets the best product in front of your users. This leaves a ton of wiggle room for you and your team to figure out what works best for you. Your job as a product manager is just to make sure that your team is as effective as possible. That means that you actually spend a lot of your day executing, making sure that all the things that are supposed to happen actually do happen. Let's talk about some of the execution skills that are required of a product manager. First, communication is a really big part of your job. I spend most of my day in email, writing decks and docs, or in meetings. There are a few key counterparts who I always make sure that I have strong lines of communication with. The first is my team. Communication within your team is critical to make sure that everyone is working towards the same goal. It also helps clear any blockers that your team might run into and helps solve tough problems together. For example, my team has a weekly sync meeting where we share status updates, talk about any challenges that we're facing, and also celebrate recent wins and launches or deep dives on things that we're working on. It's critical to any collaboration you have with other teams that your communication is working well. This is especially true if you don't sit next to each other or you don't regularly work together. When we collaborate with other teams, we rely a lot on written communication. Usually this is in the form of emails, creating bugs, or taking notes during meetings so people understand what decisions have been made and also have a chance to respond. Lastly, as a product manager, you're a representative of your team to leadership. It's up to you to make sure that leadership is aware of what you're working on and why it's important. Often this takes the form of presentations with executives, but it can also look like a team email celebrating a recent launch or something that your team has learned recently. Communication's critical to the product manager role because you want to make sure that your team is a well-oiled machine, and communication helps grease the wheels. That said, there's a ton of other work that goes into making sure that a product is running well. First, being organized and project tracking helps make sure that you're hitting critical deadlines. Let's say timing gets a little bit short. Do you end up cutting features, or do you add more people to the project? That also means that prioritization is critical for any PM. There will always be a time, inevitably, where you have to choose between working on one thing or working on another. And it's up to you to pick what's most important to set your team up for success. You have to be willing to make the tough calls. And lastly, you have to be willing to iterate. Sometimes you'll run an experiment to validate your hypothesis, and it turns out that you have to pivot. Other times you'll run into a technical barrier, maybe, that you didn't anticipate, that requires you to change your approach. As a product manager, you always have to be willing to learn and respond to new information in order to deliver the best product. Now that we've shared a bit about what the day of an APM looks like, let's talk about the interview process, how best to prepare, and what we're looking for. There will also be a later session on more about the process and how to prepare, so make sure you stay tuned for that. I'll start with the logistics. Applications for the APM full-time role are already open. Applications for the internship role open on September 17th. You can find both applications online at google.com/careers. Just search for Associate Product Manager. Once you submit an online application, your resume will be reviewed by a recruiter. And if you're selected to interview, the interview process starts with a phone interview. The phone interview is about 45 minutes with a product manager. And it's pretty helpful to be in a quiet space and have a pen and paper handy in case you want to make notes for yourself. If that goes well, the next round has 2 parts. You'll complete a written assignment, and in parallel, you'll come on site for a day of interviews with product managers and an engineer. If you're applying for the internship, your feedback will be reviewed and you'll hear back on a decision at this point. If you're applying for a full-time role, you'll have one more round of interviews with Brian Rakowski. Brian was in the first APM class, and he's now a VP in hardware. He also sponsors the APM program. Following your interview with Brian, you'll then hear back from the hiring committee on your offer and decision. Let's talk a little bit about some of the skills that we're looking for during the interview process. We'll talk about each of these: product insight, analytical ability, technical ability, and your communication skills. We also really value creativity in all of our product managers. Starting with product interviews. Here, we really just want to understand how you think about what makes for the best user experience. We love to see creativity and user empathy. Some of the ways that I prepared for product interviews were to think about products that I liked and products that I didn't really like. I thought about what was good or bad about them. What should I change about them? Which of those changes would I think is the most important? And what kind of success metrics would I pick to understand if the change I made was successful or not? An example of a product question might be something like, if you had to build the next feature for search, what would it be? Why did you pick that? Next, we'll talk a little bit about analytical interviews. Here, we really want to understand how you reason through problems. Break down the problem, use logic. In many cases, we're not necessarily looking for a particular answer, but we really just want to understand how you think. Structure your response and show your work along the way. Those will both help your interviewer understand your thought process. A good way to practice for analytical interviews is to talk through a problem out loud. This helps communicate your thought process and will be useful during the analytical portion of your interviews. An example of an analytical question might be something like an estimation question. So, how many Android phones are sold in the US every year? Lastly, we'll talk about your technical interviews. Your technical skills are evaluated by an engineer. And really, we want to understand if you can talk about building technology in a meaningful way. There's no expertise in a particular coding language required. And coding questions aren't asked often, but you might be asked about anything that you choose to share on your resume. Some useful ways to prepare for technical interviews are to practice with a friend. Talking out loud to solve a technical problem can feel pretty different from solving it on your own. The interview will also cover computer science fundamentals, so make sure to brush up on algorithms, understanding data structures, high-level architecture. Now that we've covered the interview process, we're going to spend some time covering your live Q&A. One of the things that I remember wondering when I was applying were, what's the best part about being a product manager? I can say that my favorite thing about being a product manager is that you get to wear a ton of different hats, which means you get to think about a problem from many different perspectives. You get to think about the technical perspective, you also get to think about user experience and design, and you also get to think about the business and strategy side of the problem. And I really get to enjoy that multidimensional problem solving. We also have a question on how technical is the PM role. Different PM roles can be varyingly technical. It depends a little bit on the product that you're working on, but all PMs at Google have a technical background, which is really important for being able to work successfully with engineering teams. Part of the reason for this is understanding what kinds of problems are easy to solve or hard to solve. We have another question. Do PMs ever travel around to other campuses? Yes, all the time. That's one of, I think, for me, one of the perks of working at Google is I've gotten to travel a lot for this job. So I guess in the past few weeks, I've been to our New York office and our London office, and I'm currently based in San Francisco. So it depends a little bit on the product you're working on. Usually you'll travel either to do user research or to work with other people at Google who sit in other offices if you're collaborating with a different team. We have a question from Arjun. What's the biggest challenge that new incoming product managers face at Google? This is a good question. I think it depends a little bit on the person. I think the hardest thing for me was making sure that I was picking the right problems to solve. So one of the things that I touched on earlier on in the presentation. And I think the thing that made this easier for me was realizing that I could reach out to people who had spent more time on the team and were maybe a little bit more familiar with the problem space, and also trusting my own judgment. everyone who joins Google is really smart and really qualified, and you should trust that if you join Google, you shouldn't question yourself. What's the internship like? We have a question from Ernesto on what the internship is like and if it's comparable to a single rotation of the full-time role. So in some ways, yes, it's comparable. In other ways, no. The internship is only for a summer, so it's 3 months long, which means that it's a lot shorter than your first rotation, which is a full year. You'll have similar responsibilities, but your project timeline will be shorter. So one of the nice things about joining full-time is that you get to spend a little more time with the team and on the problem space, and that gives you a little more opportunity to develop expertise in that area. But the internship is designed to be very similar to the full-time role, and so it will be similar in many ways. We have a question from Benjamin Jackson. As an APM intern at Google, do you work on one large product or a couple of smaller products? So during the internship program, you'll be assigned to a team, you'll have a manager, and that's the same as for the full-time role. So you'll work on the one large product that your team works on, but usually you won't be a product manager, say, for all of Chrome. You'll be a product manager for some area of Chrome. For example, I work on Chrome for our growth in new markets. But there are a lot of other product managers on Chrome who work on other aspects. So, for example, I focus mostly on Android, but there's a whole PM team that works on the desktop product. We have a question from Sadek Hashemi. Could you please talk more about finding a problem and researching possible solutions? So I think you'll find that there's no shortage of problems to solve and things to work on at Google. One of the harder parts is picking which pieces. So I'll start with finding a problem. Usually these come through either we've identified something in our metrics that we'd like to grow or change, something in user feedback that we think is a problem and that we want to improve the quality of our products, or in some cases it's a totally new opportunity where we think that there's an unmet user need and we want to enter that space. So they can come from a bunch of different places. In terms of picking which ones to solve, it's a combination of making sure that you're delivering the best user experience and making sure that you're choosing the thing that's strategically important for your team and for the company. Ways to kind of figure that out and assess which ones are the most important go back to establishing what your team's goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. And you'll find that if you can set a measurable way of understanding which things are the most important, you can stack rank your projects against those metrics. We have another question from Aresh Amleshil. What are some resources you found personally helpful for developing your ability to perform your role as a product manager? This is a good question. So early on, when I was interviewing, I actually used 2 books. One was called Cracking the PM Interview, and the other one was called Cracking the Coding Interview. So that really helped me before I joined Google. There's a bunch of other resources that are both about product management or different kind of professional skills that you can look at. When you join as an APM, there's a recommended reading list, which is a great way to get started. But in the meantime, it's pretty helpful. There are a lot of blogs about product management on Medium, for example, that I like to read. But there are also a lot of interesting books about how to manage a team well or how to set yourself up for success. A book that my now manager, former manager, recommended to me when I was joining the team was a book called First 90 Days. And it talks a little bit about how to set goals for your first 90 days on the job and to hit the ground running. All right, we have time for one more question. We have a question from Yash. As an APM, will we be paired up with a full-time PM on our team that will guide us through the process? Yes. So every APM is assigned a manager, But there's also a bunch of other support that comes through the APM program. So you not only have your manager, you'll also have an APM buddy who's an APM in the class above you, so has just kind of been through their first rotation and can share a lot about their experience with you. You'll also have an APM alumni advisor, so that's someone who's been through the APM program but has more product management experience at Google and sits on a steering committee that helps plan the APM program. You can also find a lot of unofficial mentors. So you might be paired with a buddy on your team, but generally people at Google are always willing to help. And so whoever you end up reaching out to or connecting with can also become a mentor during your time at Google. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And remember, we have an upcoming session that shares more about the interview process, what we're looking for, and how best to prepare.